What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into 5 budget decks that I put together for you. These aren't like my typical budget decks, where these decks, for the most part, all have more than the typical 4 rares I try to limit myself to when it comes to creating budget decks. But these are definitely the next step if you're looking to get into something a little bit more competitive than my typical budget decks, as these decks are definitely upgradable. They are upgrade paths based on adding additional lands, adding additional rares or copies of rares to the decks. But these are definitely decks to get you started. I have 5 of them for you. So with that being said, let's dive into the first one and let's just talk about it. So first deck up here on the list is going to be my Simic Deathtouch deck that I've kind of been messing around with. I thought for a minute that I was going to go Golgari, but I feel like Golgari has kind of been done and tried before, but I want to play with some of the Simic cards, as there are some that are going to be rotating out shortly with the rotation coming in September. And the other thing too is when it comes to the mana base, if you do have, you know, the dual lands or the pathways from the older sets, you could always play them in some of the, instead of like the tap Thornwood Falls that I currently have in the deck. I didn't want you to create cards that eventually will rotate out. You know, there are other cards from like Strixhaven, like the Quandra Command and stuff like that as well, that, you know, it's a very limited amount of copies, and if you want to go ahead and create it, you can, or possibly look for other options. But overall, the deck is pretty good in that sense of what it's trying to do. First card up in the deck is we're gonna have some Fate and Hope, kind of break apart maybe what our opponent's trying to do on their side of the board. Definitely great against like a deck that's playing like runes, as you know, you can always bounce a creature back that has a bunch of runes on it, and then, you know, bounce it back to their hand. They have to redo it all over again. We got the 1 copy of Spell Pierce, just in case our opponent tries to do something kind of crazy. You can counter target enchantment, counter target, destroy effect. You know, for 1 mana, they have to pay 2 additional mana. Definitely good for the tempo in the early game. We got 2 copies of Fenga Shigeki, definitely great 1/1 Death Toucher. Your opponent's, especially in the early game, is not going to want to block a Death Toucher, because a Death Toucher can get rid of any particular creature that your opponent may have, regardless of its power, because of the Death Touch ability. We have a couple Snakeskin Veils here just to put a +1/+1 counter to her target creature control. It will gain Hexproof, so if they try to, do a spot removal spell, it will protect that creature from getting rid of by a spot removal spell. We have the Tajaru Blade, the 4 copies of these. Yet again, another 1/1 Death Toucher. If you only have 2 copies of these, but you have 4 copies of Fenga Shigeki, these are interchangeable. They do the same exact thing, so whichever you prefer, you can have 4 of one and 2 of the other. Definitely doesn't matter, but I went with 4 of these and 2 of the other. But like I said, you could do 3 and 3 if you really wanted to keep it balanced. Then we also have Tameo Safekeeping. 2 copies of it. We're kind of splitting this with the Snakeskin Veil. 2 copies of Snakeskin Veil, 2 copies of Tameo Safekeeping. Target property control gains Hexproof and Indestructible in a turn, which gets around board wipe type effects, minus Meathook Massacres. But overall, yet again, another good card. Gives us protection, from particular board removal and or spot removal spell, and we also get a little bit of life out of it, which is definitely very good. We also have 2 copies of Jawari Disruption here, as it can be played as a land in the late game if our opponent has a bunch of mana open that they can definitely pay the 1 for. In the early game, it can kind of be that tempo play if we feel like our opponent is kind of being a bit aggressive and tapping out fully to play a lot of their spells. We can always draw a Disruption for it, and definitely catches your opponent off by surprise, because typically I feel like they don't think of a Simic deck and also think of Death Touch in that sense, so definitely a pretty interesting card to have. Then we have Fang of the Fangbearer. This is what's going to make our deck work a lot better, as it's going to create all our creatures that have Death Touch, allow them to deal combat damage to a player. They get 2 poison counters, and when they get to 10 poison counters, they lose the game. This allows us to kind of shorten the game a lot quicker, because we could get a bunch of creatures out with Death Touch, overwhelm your opponent that way, and then get in for that additional points of damage, and then we just kill them by poison. We have Kappa Tech Wrecker. It's a 2 mana 1/3 ninjutsu, enters battlefield with Death Touch counter on it, so even though itself doesn't have a Death Touch counter, it enters the battlefield with Death Touch counter, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we can remove the Death Touch counter from it. If we do, we get to exile target artifact or enchantment that player controls. So overall, pretty good way to kind of sneak a creature out into the battlefield, get a little bit Death Touch in. This just allows us to kind of get that additional effect. Let's just say they play a Portable Hole, any sort of spot removal spell that's going to exile one of our creatures, we can always, destroy it with this card in particular. Then we have Master's Rebuke. Great part about Death Touch is that we can deal damage with any of our Death Touchers to any of their creatures, as long as it doesn't have Indestructible. That damage dealt will actually kill the creature because of Death Touch ability, and definitely a great spot removal spell for the deck. Also at instant speed for 2 mana, not that bad. We have a couple copies of Venom's Connoisseur. Yet again, a pretty interesting card here. It's a pretty good card in the sense that whenever a creature enters the battlefield, she will gain Death Touch. And then if we play multiple spells on the same turn because of the Alliance ability, all our creatures will gain Death Touch. So just in case, if let's just say we get rid of the Death Touch counter here with Kappa Tech Wrecker, we can always give it Death Touch in another way, like casting another one of these with Ninjutsu, playing one during our main phase. Triggering the secondary ability will just kind of, hopefully make sure all our creatures have Death Touch. We have Decisive Denial, a fight spell here. Two creatures fight, one on our side, one on their side. Just a fight spell. You gotta give Death Touch. Will kill the creature as long as they don't have any sort of way to protect it or give it indestructibility. And then on the same side, we can always counter target non-creature spell unless it's control phase 3. So we're playing a little bit of that tempo game. We're kind of slowing down our opponent from playing big things, or spell-wise. So definitely kind of combating that. Then we have the Needlethorn Drake, a 2-mana 1/1 flying Death Toucher. So a little bit evasive, kind of getting over the board just in case they clog up the ground game. The Death Touch will get over that way. So we get in for those points of Death Touch damage against our opponent. And then in the 3-drop slot, we have the Quandrix Command, the 3-mana, choose 2. We have to return target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. So possibly bounce effect at instant speed. We can counter target artifact or enchantment spell. Definitely good there. We have to put 2+1/+1 counters in target creature. So if we feel like we can try to win against our opponent with just direct damage, we can pump one of our creatures up to get that additional damage in. Or we can also target player shuffles up to 3 target cards from their graveyard to the library. So if there's cards that we may have had gotten removed from the game by being board wiped, spot removal spells, or we played other spells, we can always cast this Quandrix Command, shuffle them back into our library, and hopefully we draw them again to kind of keep that tempo going. Then the mana base is pretty straightforward. Nothing super crazy. We have 7 of the islands, 9 of the forests. We have 4 of the Dreamroot Cascades, and we also have 1 copy of the Thornwood Falls. Not a lot of mana in the sense, there is a total of 21 lands. The deck isn't super expensive. Really capping at 2 with a couple of 3-drop spells. But overall, pretty, tempo-y style Death Touch deck to try to get the win by getting your opponent with poison instead of the normal damage. So overall, pretty cool deck. Definitely something I would check out if I was you. But with that being said, let's move on to the next deck. The next deck up here on the list is going to be a Naya Landfall deck. This is actually kind of an interesting list I kind of came across I didn't create this myself, but with the new additional lands that we got from Streets of New Capenna, these like sack lands that immediately get sacrificed when they come into the battlefield, it's definitely kind of interesting as it kind of combines pretty well with another card we have, which is Splendid Reclamation. It's a 4-mana return all land cards from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped, which is definitely very good, which then triggers these again because these don't have to be tapped to actually trigger. So they'll come back onto the battlefield. They'll all immediately get sacrificed right as they come in. You'll search your library for more lands, triggering additional landfall triggers, which is definitely pretty interesting kind of trick there. Getting those additional landfall triggers with our various landfall things. Definitely a pretty interesting card to have in the deck. I will say this is probably one of the more expensive decks in the list as it does have a lot more rares. But if you have a lot of cards from Zendikar Horizon, there's a good chance you may have a lot of these cards, as a majority of what we're trying to play is things that have landfall triggers. So other than maybe a couple cards from Crimson Vow and the new set, there's not really too much else that you really need to invest in if you have a lot of Zendikar Horizon. So in our 1-drop slot, we have our 0/1 Akuma Hellhound. It's a 0/1 landfall hound dog that enters whenever land enters battlefield under our turn, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So turn 1 you play it, turn 2 you drop one of your fetch lands. It becomes a 4/5 that you're already hitting your opponent in the face with. Definitely a pretty good landfall creature for the deck. Then we have the Fearless Fledgling, yet again another card I played previously here on the channel. It's a 2-mana 1/1 bird that whenever a land enters battlefield under our control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then it also gains flying to end of turn, so it gets that little bit of evasive. Over time, it will just become a big creature that your opponent just has to get rid of. Then we have the Brushfile Elemental. This card was definitely very popular when it first released, as it's definitely a very aggressive card. It definitely gets around a lot of small creatures that your opponent may play in the current way standard is. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. It has haste, so we can attack immediately once it comes out into the battlefield. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, it gets +2/+2 in end of turn. Yet again, another card that just gets pumped up every time a land comes out. Fetch lands is kind of a reason why we're playing a bunch of them for this card and this card, so that they get pumped up very, very big. We have Crush the Weak here. It deals 2 damage to each creature. If a creature was dealt damage this way, it would die, exile instead. And we can foretell it for 1, so it gets around, a bunch of little small creatures. It's kind of like our little mini Meat Hook Massacre for 2 against our opponent, possibly, that we can play it for 1 mana instead of 3 mana. Yet again, just a little bit of board wipe action in case we need it. We have Valakut Exploration. It's a 3-mana enchantment spell with landfall whenever land enters the battlefield under control. We have to exile top card of our library. We may play this card as long as it remains exiled. At the beginning of our end step, if there are there are cards exiled with Valakut Expiration, put them into their owner's graveyard, and then it deals that much damage to each opponent. So depending on how many times we landfall trigger, we can do 1 damage, we can do 2 damage, we can do 3, 4 damage, depending on how many times we get to trigger that landfall. They have Rolling Regrowth, a 3-mana instant speed spell that at instant speed we can sacrifice a land. We get to search our library for up to 2 basic lands, put them onto the battlefield, tap, and then shuffle. Yet again, there'll be a lot of shuffling of the library with this deck, as we will play Rolling Regrowth. We'll sacrifice one of the lands we probably tap to play this spell. We got 2 other lands tapped, triggering 2 landfall triggers. Maybe, you know, get a little bit of that additional pump that our opponent may not be expecting during combat. Maybe get in for an additional like 8 damage, possibly, depending on how many creatures we have out that have pumps with landfall triggers. Definitely a pretty cool card that works very well with the deck. Then we have Scute Swarm here. It's a 3-mana 1/1 insect. It has landfall triggers. If you haven't seen this card, initially it just pumps out these generic 1/1 insects, and then once we get to 6 or more lands out in the battlefield, we get to create Scute Swarm copies. So once you start getting into like the 10, 20 Scute Swarm copies, the game starts to lag out. But yet again, this is a card that's going to help us get very wide. Though I will say the one thing, just kind of going off, just talking about it real quick before we kind of get into it, this is a deck that's very susceptible to like a Meathook Massacre, as we do play a lot of creatures that, yes, they can trigger with the landfall triggers and become big creatures. They're not very big when we don't get to trigger that landfall. So yet again, something that we could get taken advantage of if we do play against a deck that plays Meathook Massacre. They have Dire Strain Rampage. It's a 3-mana sorcery spell. We have to destroy target artifact, enchantment, or land. If a land was destroyed this way, its controller may search the library for 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield, tap, and then shuffle their library. Otherwise, its controller may search the library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, and then shuffle. So this can be used in 2 different ways, right? We can target our opponent's lands. Maybe their opponent's like playing a lot of non-basics. Maybe we think they don't have a basic lands to search for. We can target their lands, kind of get them off a particular color. If they play, maybe they only have 1 blue source, but they're playing Esper. We can target their blue source. They may not be able to fetch that additional not basic blue source, and we can cut them off mana wise that way. We can play it on our turn. We can sacrifice one of our lands, get 2 lands out of it, and then we can flash it back and do it all over again. Or we can get rid of an artifact or enchantment if our opponents try to spot removal spell, with an enchantment or something like that, or if they play a particular artifact and we want to get rid of it, we can do it that way. But overall, pretty good card that works very well with our deck. Because we are a landfall deck, Felidar Retreat makes the list. It's a 4-mana enchantment with landfall, and then we can choose 1. We get to get 2/2 black Cappies creature tokens. We get to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, and those creatures gain vigilance, so it allows us to attack in and then also leave creatures back as blockers. If we can kind of combine this with Scute Swarm triggers, it's definitely very good, because we can give all the tokens that have now just come out to the battlefield +1/+1 counters and vigilance, so they're a little bit bigger, so your opponent has to tap out a little bit more for Meathook Massacre, but overall pretty decent. And then we got Splendid Reclamation. I kind of briefly went over this. All the fetch lanes that we played earlier in the game, we can play this spell. We get them all back from the battlefield tapped, allowing us to go into our library. Essentially, if we've probably cast like 3 or 4 fetch lanes, we can probably bring them out and maybe thin out the deck even further, which will allow us to get very, very big landfall triggers. The one thing I will say, you probably want to wait till an opportunity to probably cast a spell when you can probably get in for a decent amount of damage. Maybe you have a Scute Swarm out, maybe you have other things out. This will allow you to kind of get through for that additional damage, which is definitely very, very good. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 3 plains, 6 mountains, 7 forests, and then we have 12 copies of the three of the family, fetch lands, I should say. We have the Broker's Hideout, we have the Cabretti Courtyard, and the Riveteer's Outlook. So these are the cards that are going to allow us to kind of, search for these and also trigger our landfall triggers. And because they come into battle immediately and get sacrificed, like I said, when we play this card, they'll all get sacrificed again, allow us to go search our library yet again for more lands to kind of do that all over again. With that being said, this deck looks definitely pretty fun, looks definitely very potent. If you're wanting to, try out another landfall deck, I know I did one the other day. It didn't go very successful, but this is definitely a list I would recommend playing if you're looking for a different version of a landfall deck, that if you want to try that kind of a mechanic. This next deck up on the list is a Boros enchantment / artifact deck. We aren't playing, runes or anything like that. We're trying to do artifacts and also enchantments in other ways and trying to get in aggressively that way. Overall, pretty decent deck. It plays a little bit of mitigation, especially against the early game stuff, and allowing us to try to get in for damage, maybe through or around characters. Has a little bit more evasiveness in that regard. A little bit extra protection. Some of the cards have ward on them, allowing us to kind of, protect them from, our opponent having to play additional mana in order to, actually target that creature with a spell directly. But overall, pretty cool deck of what it's trying to do. There are some familiar cards you may see in a Rune deck, but this is definitely a different overall deck from that. First card being up is Portable Hole. Great artifact spell, 1 mana. Exile target non-land permanent opponent controls with mana value 2 or less until it leaves the battlefield. It can target any sort of token that your opponent may play. It can target their small creatures, maybe even they're rune creatures in that regard, which is definitely very good. For 1 mana, definitely a great artifact spell. Then we have Gold Honed Hound. It's a 1 mana 1/1 first strike menace. Typically, you probably see this card more in limited, but it's definitely a card that works well for this deck, as it has first strike and also has menace, so your opponent has to commit 2 creatures to block it. So early on, it can get in for maybe a point of damage here and there. It can also be sacrificed for 1 mana of any color. You can also put certain enchantments on it to pump it up. Definitely pretty good creature overall in that regard. They have Kamano, Faces of Kakazan. It's a 1 mana enchantment. It deals 1 damage to each opponent, and if they control each planeswalker, they also deal 1 damage to the planeswalker they control. When we cast our next creature spell in Chapter 2, it enters battlefield with additional +1/+1 counter, making that creature that much tougher. And then on Chapter 3, we get to flip it over. We get our 2/2 haste creature here with Etching of Kamano, and it has a 2/2 haster, and whenever a creature would be dealt damage this turn by a source we control would die, it gets exiled instead, which kind of gets around graveyard effects when creatures go into the graveyard, triggering maybe an ability. Definitely a pretty good card for only 1 mana. We got Rabbit Battery. It's a 1 mana 1/1 haster. We can equip it, or it's a creature itself. It has Reconfigure, but it is a 1/1, has haste. Reconfigure for 1. In itself, it's definitely very good. I believe if you equip it to something, it gives it haste. If that's how I remember how it works. It says it right there now that I'm reading it. But overall, very, very good card. Can get in for early points of damage and then move it around where you think you can, get in for that additional points of damage. We have Sticky Fingers in the deck because it gives target creature menace. Also, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, we get to create a treasure token, which is definitely very good. And then whenever enchanted creature dies, we get to draw a card. So if they remove the creature, we get a card out of it. If they let the damage go in for enough turns, we get a bunch of treasure counters, so allowing us to ramp up pretty quick, allowing us to cast our bigger spells in the deck. So overall, very, very card for only 1 mana. Next card up is Lumeric Aspirant. It's a 2 mana 1/1. This is a card you see probably in all the mono white decks, and I actually think in my Boros burn deck you've also seen this card. But it is a 1/1 for 2 mana that at the beginning of our combat, we get to put a +1/+1 counter target creature we control, so just pumping our creatures. Overall, very, very good card. Definitely going to help us out get in that additional damage. We have Mishago's Reign of Truth, a 2 mana enchantment that target creature we control gets +1/+1 to end a turn for each artifact and or enchantment control, which is pretty awesome. So our creatures can become very, very big, very, very early. And then on Chapter 3, we get to exile it, and we get a creature here that gets +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment control. So a creature itself, that could be a 3/3, 4/4, depending on how many other artifacts and or enchantments we control when it flips to Chapter 3. And in the early turns, it makes one of our creatures just that much bigger and that much more aggressive against our opponent. Then we have Patchwork Automaton. It's a 2 mana 1/1 with Ward 2. Whenever we cast an artifact spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Patchwork Automaton. So a card that is pretty great in the early game because it's hard to target with a direct spell. Only real way to remove it is to do some sort of global board wipe in the early game, as that gets around Ward. Making your opponent pay 2 or it gets countered is definitely very good. You can put various enchantments on it. You can put some Sticky Fingers on it. We play a Rabbit Battery, which is also very good for 1 mana afterwards. This will then become a 2/2. We can equip it, becomes a 3/3. So overall, very, very good card. And as we play other artifacts and enchantments in the deck, it become even bigger. We have Maul the Skyclaves out in the 3-drop slot. It's a 3 mana Maul that enters the battlefield. We get to target immediately 2 target creature control. And no equipped creature gets +2/+2, has flying and first strike, making us get that evasiveness over the top, which is definitely very good. And then if our creature would die or we want to move it, we can pay 4 mana and then just move it to a different creature, which is kind of expensive. It is kind of more expensive than the actual initial cost, but this is going to help us finish out the game, getting over the top where maybe our opponent's not playing a lot of reach creatures and or flying creatures. Then we have Reckless Stormseeker. It's a 3 mana 2/3. At the beginning of our combat, each turn we get to target a creature we control gets +1/+0 and hasten to end a turn on the daybound side, which is definitely good. And on the nightbound side, essentially the difference is that target creature will get +2/+0, trample, and hasten to end a turn. So the creature gets +1 more in power. It also gets trample, but it still gets haste, and then itself it is a 3/4, so itself is actually a pretty aggressive creature. And then it starts the daybound nightbound cycle as well when it initially gets paid, if there's nothing else on the battlefield. So overall, very good card if you're trying to get very, very aggressive. Then we have one copy of the Alchemist Gambit. This is kind of like one of those things, like if you know your opponent's low and you got one swing, you're like, I just need one more turn and I don't want to let them go and maybe, stabilize. This is going to be that card. You can go all in for 3 mana, take an extra turn after this one. During that turn, damage can be prevented, so they can't play any sort of fog effect. And then if at the end of our next turn's end step, we lose the game. So if we don't kill them on the turn afterwards, we essentially lose the game, and then when we cast it, we exile Alchemist Gambit. But overall, it's going to be that card that's going to help us kind of maybe finish the game if our opponent gets down to like 7, and we know we can do 7 more damage on the following turn. This is kind of like that, hope shot, kind of one-off. Let's just try our best to kind of double, to take 2 turns and just kind of finish our opponent. Then we have Angel Fire Ignition. It's a 3 mana sorcery. We have to put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. It also gains Vigilance, Trample, Lifelink, Indestructible, and Haste on turn, so it allows us to get just in for a lot of damage. Puts +1/+1 counters on target creature control, so those counters will stay even after the effect goes away. And then we can flash it back for 4 mana, so for 1 additional mana, get the spell all over again, and get it for another big points of damage. Overall, kind of like our Embercleave-esque card of the deck, which is going to allow us to kind of finish off our opponent. Mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 7 plains, 7 mountains. We have 4 of the Sundown Passes, and we have 1 of the Windscar Crags. Like I said, if you have pathways, you have those lands, you can always add them in. Maybe take out a couple of basics, take out the Windscar Crag, and add them in that way. Yet again, I'm trying to kind of somewhat future-proof these decks. Some cards may rotate out, but there's still a lot of cards in the deck that will last you into rotation when that happens. But overall, a very, very good starter list. Definitely very, very aggressive. I do think even by itself, without really any upgrades, this deck list is definitely pretty good. So the next deck list up on the list is going to be an Azorius Aggro deck. This is kind of similar to the Azorius Magecraft deck I played the other day, but this one's not really focusing on Magecraft. It's focusing on, yes, we're playing additional spells, but we're not pumping our creatures by doing so. We'll get additional triggers. It's kind of how this deck kind of works. So we play a lot of the same cheap spells that will help us trigger certain things. But, we are just trying to play spells that benefit us from casting multiple spells on the same turn. One of those cards is being the Ledger Shredder. This card has, kind of popped up as being a very, very good card for what it really is. It's a 2 mana 1/3 with flying. Whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, it gets the Connive, so allowing us to draw a card, discarding a card, possibly pumping itself up, becoming bigger. Definitely a good card. We also have Storm Drake Chaser. It's a card that whenever it becomes a target of a spell, we get to draw a card, which is also pretty good. We also play Delver of Secrets because we are playing a lot of non-creature spells. We're hoping to flip this card to get a 3/2 flyer. Overall, pretty interesting deck. Like I said, it's very similar. A lot of cards in the deck are also very similar to that Magecraft deck, but we aren't playing around the Magecraft triggers. We're just playing around, essentially, using non-creature spells to kind of pump our team. We have Guiding Voice in here, giving them +1/+1 counter on target creature. We get to learn, allowing us to go into our learn board, which we have things like Academic Probation if we need to get through a creature, or we don't want to. If we know an opponent has a particular card or plays a particular card, we can prevent them from playing that card. We have Environmental Sciences in case we need to fix our mana, as we only play 4 dual lands and the rest are all basics. We have Reduced to Memory in case you need to get rid of something that's in your way. We have Teach-ins just in case your opponent has a lot more cards. There's a good chance that we'll cast a lot of cards in our hand and we won't have a lot of cards, so it'll help us kind of refill back up. And we have Expanded Anatomy, just giving those additional +1/+1, 2 +1/+1 counters and giving our creature Vigilance to end a turn, allowing us to kind of stay back and block as well. Next card up on the list is going to be Homestead Courage. It is a 1 mana sorcery spell that gets a +1/+1 counter on target creature control. It gains Vigilance to end a turn, and then we can flash it back and do it all over again, either cast it on the same creature or cast it on one of our other creatures we want to keep back as well as in defense. We have Wings of the Cosmos, another 1 mana instant that gives target creature +1/+3, gives it flying to end a turn, and then we get to untap it, allowing us to kind of, either, tack in, not play this, and kind of play it off like, oh, we're going to just attack in. Our opponent goes and attacks back. We can surprise our opponent by casting this spell, untapping our creature, pumping its power and toughness, and then, you know, catching our opponent off guard. So definitely a pretty good card there. Like I said, Delver's Secrets, initially it's a 1/1, but if we reveal a top card of our library and send a non-creature spell, it flips over and becomes a 3/2 flyer. Definitely good there. Slip out the back. Yet again, I think this is going to be one of those spells that's definitely very good. It's a +1/+1 counter target creature, and that creature phases out until the start of their controller's next turn, which allows us to kind of, you know, if our opponent board wipes or maybe tries to use some sort of spot removal, this kind of allows us to flicker the card off our battlefield and then kind of protecting it from a particular spell without giving it a hexproof. You see a guard approach. We get to choose one. We can tap target creature, or target creature control gains hexproof at end of turn, so protecting our creature. We have March of the Swirling Mist. One of the marches I haven't seen a lot of play out, but definitely a good march regardless. We can up to X target creatures phase out. So yet again, this is kind of like one of the spells. We have a bunch of creatures on the battlefield, or enough that our opponents can maybe try to meat hook. We play this, we phase out all our creatures, they meat hook, nothing gets wiped on their board, they may wipe a couple of their creatures, and then we kind of get that advantage that way. So overall, pretty good card there. We have the Illuminator in the deck, a 2-mana 1/1 double striker. Whenever it becomes a target of a spell, we get to we control it connive, so allowing us to draw a card, discarding a card, pumping itself becomes very, very big, very, very quickly, and then becomes a problem. We have Show Confidence, a spell that, you know, every time we cast a spell before this spell will get copied based on, you know, how many spells we played before it, and we get to choose new targets for the copy, and then the spell itself gets puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains vigilance at end of turn, so you can use it in your pre-combat step before you declare attacks. You can, you know, give all your creatures vigilance and give them additional +1/+1 counters. You attack in, maybe showing like an okay modest attack, but not anything super crazy, and then all of a sudden you play this afterwards, and then all of a sudden all your creatures get pumped up. So definitely kind of one of those things that you can play around. It also triggers very well with the Ledger Shredder, because if we get an additional copy, that counts as 2 spells, which is definitely very good, and it triggers this ability. We have the Security Bypass, definitely a good card that I feel like is it's more on the limited side, but it's still a very good card. It's a 2-mana enchantment. As long as enchanted creature is attacking alone, it can't be blocked. And then whenever enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, it connives, so giving it one of our creatures additional connive ability. There's also a thing that I'm thinking now here is you can also play Fairy Vandal if we're going to be drawing a lot of cards, because that's a card that just benefits from us drawing an additional card during a turn. So it's definitely a good card also to think about possibly add in. Maybe you can cut back on some Stormdrake Chasers if you don't feel like Stormdrake Chasers doing much for you. Yes, it will allow us to draw a card whenever it becomes a target of a spell, but it's not going to grow and get any bigger. So maybe that's a spell maybe that's an area that you could put Fairy Vandals in instead if you want to play that. But Stormdrake Chasers, yet again, another 2-drop. Like I said, 2/1 flyer. Whenever it gets targeted a spell we control, you get to draw a card, so overall pretty good there. And the mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 10 plains, 9 islands, and 4 of the Zerta beaches. Yet again, 23 lands. Yet again, the deck isn't super expensive. 1 and 2 mana sources. You don't really need too many lands in this deck to really make it work. We have ways of getting lands in case we need them. But overall, pretty good deck that can, yet again, pack a pretty decent punch and kill your opponent pretty quickly. Next deck up on the list is going to be a Selesnya Magecraft deck. This is yet again a list that is kind of like my Magecraft deck I've played before. There are some similar cards you've seen before, but we're also splashing green, which allows us to play other cards that I think will benefit from allowing us to kind of use some other tricks in order to kind of get that additional points of damage in against our opponent. So I will say off the bat, we are playing, the Clever Luminancer, the 1-mana 0/1. It gets +2/+2 in a turn based on how many spells we get to cast, or spells, instants, or sorceries we cast during our turn. We have the Leonine Light Scribe, yet again another thing that gives all our whole team +1/+1 to end a turn. We also have the Eager First Year, which is a card by itself that whenever we cast instant or sorcery gets +1/+0 to end a turn. So we are playing a lot of creatures that will trigger the Magecraft ability. The one thing, because we are playing green, we are also casting Dragon's Guard Elite. It's a 2-mana 2/2. Whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we get the +1/+1 counter on it. And if we have 6 mana, we can tap 6 and double the amount of +1/+1 counters in Dragon's Guard Elite. So this is a card that will get +1/+1 counters every time we cast a non-creature spell. So overall gets it very big. Because we aren't playing blue, but we're all playing green, we kind of get a couple new tricks, but we'll kind of go through everything. So first one up is Blessed Defense. It's a 1-mana instant. Target creature control gets +2/+0 and gains lifelink to end turn. If that creature dies this turn, we get to create a 1/1 white spirit token creature with flying. So kind of like, sure, a creature may die, but we also get to gain a little bit of life, get a creature out of it, so we still have something on the board regardless of what happens. Clever Luminancer, 4 copies, a 0/1 that gets +2/+2 every time we cast an instant or sorcery. We have Wings of the Cosmos, same thing. We can use that as a pump spell, or we can use that as a protection spell in case our opponent's trying to get in for a big attack. We gotta surprise them, catch them off guard by untapping one of our creatures and give them a +1/+3. We have Massive Might. One mana instant spell where target creature gets +2/+2 and gains trample. That's the one thing that, you know, the blue white version's missing. A lot of cards will get pumped up, but they don't get any sort of trample, so your opponent can just throw chumpers in front of it and just block the damage that way. This allows us to get over the top, which is definitely very, very good. We have Wild Shape, the 1 mana instant spell that choose one until end of turn. Target creature we control has base power and toughness and becomes that creature type and gains this ability. One, it either becomes a 1/3 turtle with hexproof. One, it becomes a 1/5 spider with reach, or it becomes a 3/3 elephant with trample. So depending on the game situation and what you're trying to do, you can choose one of these based on what you need to do. Hexproof if they're targeting your creature, reach if they're trying to go over the top on you and you want to surprise them and maybe block the creature, or 3/3 elephant if you want to get in aggressively and attack your creature. The other thing too is that their base power and toughness becomes this, but if you also have triggers with the pumps and the Magecrafts, the creature becomes very, very big that way. Eager First Year, it's a 2/2 that gets +1/+0 for each spell we've cast. I don't think it's as good as the Luminancer, but it's still a decent card. You know, 2 copies of it in the deck. We have Flare of Faith, a 2 mana instant spell that target creature gets +2/+2 end of turn. If it's a human, instead it gets +3/+3 and gains indestructible. So use it as a pump spell, use it as a defensive spell, use it as a way to protect from board wipe spell. Kind of one of the things you can choose, and we play a fair amount of humans in the deck. The Elite is a human, the First Year is a human, the Luminancer is a human, the Light Scribe is not a human, but, you know, yet again, we have, you know, also the Dawnheart Wardens, which is also a human, but yet again, definitely a good spell that works very well with the deck. Like I said, we already had the Leonine Light Scribe in the deck, 4 copies of it. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, it grows the whole team until end of turn by +1/+1 for each spell we cast, and itself is a 2/2 for 2. We have Show of Confidence in the deck. Yet again, as we play a bunch of these spells, we'll get these hopefully additional triggers, triggering additional Magecraft triggers, then giving everything +1/+1 in life. Vigilance at end of turn. Worst case scenario is just used as an additional like combat trick to just get that additional copy of +1/+1. Dragon's Guard Elite, a 2 mana 2/2 that every time we cast an instant or sorcery, gets a +1/+1 counter. If we have the 6 mana available, we double those counters based on how many counters it does have. We have Kaya's Onslaught that we can catch our opponent off guard. We can foretell this for 2, then cast it for 1 mana. It gives target creature we control +1/+1 and gains double strike to end of turn, which is definitely very good. So if you get like a Luminancer at like a 4 or 5 or even a 6/7 or 6/7, you know, you can get in and then give a double strike and then hit them for 12. We also have Dawnheart Wardens. It's a 3 mana 3/3 vigilance. At the beginning of our combat on our turn, if we control 3 or more creatures with different powers, creatures you control get +1/+0 in end turn. So just a creature that just gives our whole board +1/+0. Most of the creatures in the deck all have different combats. I think our 2-drop slot, most of them are 2/2s in some way, but we can definitely, you know, cast a spell like a Magecraft spell and then just give them all different powers that way, triggering this Coven ability, and then get in for damage that way. Mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 7 of the forests, we have 7 of the plains, we have 4 of the botanical plazas. You can also play the land that gains you 1 life. This is definitely very good because you can always sacrifice it. We get to draw a card. Definitely, it's one of those things because we're not playing any blue. We don't really have a lot of wasted draw cards. And then we also have 4 of the Evergrown farmlands. So this is kind of like my list. These are some decks. Like I said, they're not super budget, but they are on the budget side. They are playing around simple mechanics. They're definitely easy to pick up on. Definitely can get you a bunch of wins in the regard if you're just trying to kind of get into the more competitive scene. Some of the lists, you could probably use some more copies of some of the rares and mythics, maybe get some other additional rares and mythics I did not have in the list. Outside of that, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely lets me know you guys like these style of videos. I tried my best to I did a poll the other day on the channel, and this is kind of like one of the things you guys want to see more of video-wise, so I wanted to make sure I did one of these. If you are new here, you want to post new videos like this on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next video.